Okay, I'm gonna kick off this subcommittee, I'm not sure what we call it. We are rail and public transportation. We have, as you know, over the last year or so, we're very hard on our smart scale scoring for our construction program. For the midst now, updating our B-Trans program, make sure that everything's in alignment, and we'll look at some more of that today as it relates to smart scale and B-Trans. But coming out of that discussion, we began a discussion in my team about rail and transit and the scoring program that we use there, the merit scoring program, which has been a great thing to have a scoring program that helps us allocate funds in a way that makes the most sense for the citizens that pay the freight for those. And so what I've asked Tiffany to do as the director, and I've asked Dr. Smoot to help lead this committee level, is to take a look at our merit scoring program and just how we allocate funds to transit and rail, and see if there's a way to improve it. Obviously, we're very performance oriented in terms of how we look at things. And we've shifted some over time from some legacy concepts to one that are tied to performance metrics, efficiency, and effectiveness, as opposed to just so I think it's a great opportunity for us at the numbers of months to review how we look at these at this program, and look at how we score and how we evaluate and how we distribute funds, and see if there's a way to just make that better, just like we did with Smart Scale. These are obviously iterative kinds of programs, and our job is to make sure that we continue to iterate them and make them better, so we get a better result back in our various hometowns where this money helps. So that's sort of the stage for hard to do here. All we got talking about this week. We pull some other folks into this committee as well, and we set a timeline, and hopefully at the end of the summer, so we should have some pretty good recommendations. Any changes that we might make. So that's where we're starting. Tiffany, Ms. Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
And I'm not going to stay with you the whole time. We've got stuff to do with our group meeting. So if I pop up and leave, I apologize for sticking out.
Thank you. If we can go to the first slide, I'm going to kick this off and then turn it over to the experts on my team. But just to complement what the Secretary just introduced, we're going to spend most of this subcommittee meeting on number one, just providing everyone, as we are leading into proposing our projects for the SIP next month, we thought this is a timely for us to share with you kind of an overview of our scoring methodology and process. We're going to start with our rail programs. They have a little bit of a different statutory requirement on what we're looking at. And we're going to go through these slides pretty quickly because we don't have a lot of time to get through some complex information. And then we're going to take a little deeper dive into our merit program and the way that we score and prioritize transit projects, because it's very complex. We want to make sure you understand where we're coming from. And we want to also share with you along the way in these slides some of the challenges we face and some areas that we feel that there's opportunity for improvement. And then we will be looking at a timeline, a prescriptive timeline by which we can propose some recommendations back to you. And we'll be asking for your input and your feedback. So thank you for being here. And with that, if I could ask Mike Todd, our Director of Rail Programs, to come forward, and we'll start by sharing our process and scoring rail projects.
Yeah, thank you. So the first thing I wanted to do is just mention that our evaluation process is actually really similar between rail and transit. We just use different methods and methodology. It's also very similar to Smart Scale. The reason why I say that is that we start first with an eligibility screening. So we receive all of our applications, the entire pool of applications that we receive. And first we just check their eligibility, reduce the number down for any that are not eligible. And then we start a data-driven scoring criteria that we look for. Once we get through that scoring criteria, we can normalize the scores and rank them. And then finally, we provide a fiscally constrained recommendation to you. So that basic architecture is kind of the same process that Smart Scale uses, the same process that Merit uses and that Rail uses. So starting with our first program in the Rail division, we have the freight program. We have 3 criteria for eligibility screening. First, the project has to align with at least 1 goal from the statewide rail plan. 2, it has to be a network capacity expansion project, so it has to increase carload throughput on the rail network. And it also has to have a minimum of 30% design already complete at the time of application, which is essentially to ensure, the project is ready and we are secure with the cost estimate. So if it meets that eligibility screening, the project moves through to score. So we score each project in 4 categories. First, we run it through a benefit cost analysis model. Depending on the score that it receives and how it compares to other projects in the application cycle, the application can receive up to 7 points for the benefit cost analysis score. Second, we look at how much matching funds the applicant is bringing to the project, getting 2 points for bringing 30% match, 3 for 40%, 6 for 50%. So in other words, we're trying to drive up the amount of matching funds that the applicant brings along with the project. Third is how many goals it aligns to within the statewide rail plan, up to 3 points total. And then finally, project readiness. This goes back to that design criteria. So we give additional points if the project has gone through additional levels of design, again, making sure that the project's ready for construction and that we're secure in the cost estimate. And so it's a total of 20 points. And we, bring every single project that's eligible through that same criteria, and then we rank them based on the number of points they receive.
Actually, any minimum number of points that it must achieve in order to be considered, just relative to the whole?
It is relative, just like Smart Scale. But obviously, the less points that it gets, the less chance it's going to have, because we're going to be, we're going to essentially run out of money to award.
Now, one other question, like, as this program most generally supported short line rail?
The freight program?
Yeah.
The freight program is a mix, I would say, in terms of monies, in terms of amount of money dedicated to projects, it probably actually leans towards the port. We have several port projects that we've done over the years. But yes, we have a good mix of short lines and then 1 or 2 Class 1 projects throughout the years as well. Yeah, Mr. Coleman.
Oh, I was going to follow up on what Ray was asking, because who are the players? Who are the people making the applicants? I was thinking CSX and Norfolk Southern. Is it others?
Less CSX and Norfolk Southern, more the port and short lines. We've also had 1 or 2 intermodal facilities, so essentially a transload private company that can apply as well for larger scale projects.
So would the port be considered somebody who can make an application?
Yes. That is a big difference between this program and Smart Scale, that the port is a qualified applicant. Thank you. So moving on to rail preservation. This is our second program. Again, 3 criteria for eligibility. First and foremost, it must be a short line railroad. So no other applicants in the pool other than short line railroads in Virginia. And then the second and third criteria kind of work in tandem with one another. Essentially, the project either needs to raise the class of track to class 2, or in the case where passenger service exists, class 3, or the project needs to support a 286,000 pound weight limit for bridges. So as long as it essentially creates that class of track or the weight limit, it's a qualifying project.
What qualifies to be a short line?
What's that?
What qualifies to be?
Short line is essentially the revenue. So if they, and to be honest, I actually don't know the baseline revenue, but it's essentially if they make less than a certain amount, they're considered a short line railroad.
How many in Virginia?
We have 9.
Like is there a rail weight requirement? You're talking about what, so much load, whatever.
On the bridges, yes, absolutely. Yes, so 286,000 pound weight limit for the bridge capacity.
You're talking about rail weight per foot or
Right.
per yard.
Yeah.
Right.
Like 132 or,
There isn't, it does depend on class of track. So we don't require it, although I don't think we have anything less than 115 around the state.
Say 100 plus, it's pretty much.
Yeah.
and it's jointed as well as welded rails, right?
It can be jointed. You'll see in our scoring criteria that we do provide additional points for if a applicant is going to change from jointed and move up to continuous welded. It's just a better service. So moving into that scoring criteria, we kind of have it categorized into basically 4 categories for the scoring criteria. So first, we look to make sure that the project aligns with code for the Rail Preservation Program, the Code of Virginia. Second, we make sure it aligns with statewide goals. Third, we assess the past investment performance of the railroad, and then we normalize the score so that we can rank them and provide recommendations. So here's a look at those 4 categories again with each of the individual scoring criteria. So with code alignment, the main purpose of this program is to maintain a state of good repair across the short line network in Virginia. So that's to just basically ensure that the capacity is preserved for the rail network.
So we have 9 short lines.
Mhm.
That's probably a pretty fixed number. Do we know the actual census of rail miles that's contained in those 9?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Do we know the condition mile by mile or it's a percentage? So,
What do you mean by condition?
well, I guess you're categorizing condition by the class,
Yes,
right?
and we do know, yes.
Okay, so I would guess a sustained class. So we know the condition that exists in that real census right now.
Yes.
So our state of good repair is something we can quantify pretty readily over time. Do the short lines, so they report into us with what I've got 100 miles of rail and 30 miles is class 1 and 50 miles is class 2.
Yep, and we have that all inventoried spatially, so it's in GIS. We can map it out and show it. Yes.
That's great.
Like which of these scoring points, if any, addresses essentially removing trucks from the highway?
Well, so we don't do a specific calculation of diverting trucks for this program, since this program is about state of good repair. However, we do under the, sorry, let me check really quickly.
Industrial
It's
rail
under the,
access.
it's under the past investments under the systemic approach. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down. We essentially look at, we provide points for projects that are realizing new truck diversion. So it improves a line to capture existing truck traffic and encourage growth for businesses on the line.
I just have to say at this point, and make it's a comment that I've made in the past. Truck diversion is all about availability of sidings. And one of the things I've kind of struggled with as we've had this rail committee meeting now for these many years is the accurate census of rail sidings that are actually supporting inbound, outbound traffic. Are we closer to that and on a statewide level? So we have an understanding of whether we're adding capacity from a truck removal from highway perspective or decreasing capacity by the loss of sidings.
We absolutely have an inventory of all of the tracks in the state and
not track, active sidings.
what's the difference between an active siding?
An active rail is of absolutely no value other than a through transit potentially. If we don't have active sidings where we can put a car in the siding and either load or unload goods. So, and we,
The mix between tracks and truck.
yeah, so if we're really looking to reduce the number of trucks on our road, then the feature we should be looking for in our existing rail network is an increasing number of active rail sidings.
You mean sidings that transload goods?
Well, a siding, yes. I mean, a siding can be for passing, but in this case, I'm talking specifically about transloading.
Okay.
That's what the rail network's for and about. It's the equivalent of, the warehouse in the trucking industry or the final user destination of the truck.
So we absolutely have an inventory of all of the physical characteristics. We probably are lacking.
Physical sidings.
Yes, like where the sidings are. We have in those locations across the entire state. Where I do think potentially we are lacking is assigning a purpose to each one of those sidings. As you know, they can have that dual purpose, like you just mentioned, where sometimes they're used for passing, sometimes they're used for storage, sometimes they're used for transit.
Not in any common road. Used for passing and using for transloading. If you can cite an example, I'd be surprised by that.
Okay.
I come back to this basic. If we don't have these transload tracks, then our rail system is of questionable value. And that's really what it comes down
Through
to.
the state.
Except to get freight through the state, maybe that keeps it off the roads. So going forward for this committee, to look at that as one of our key statistics, are we making progress or are we losing ground? I still strongly recommend being one of the factors.
Can I just interject really quick? So it sounds like you're talking about rail spurs
Spurs,
right,
sidings, right.
to industry. And so, obviously the RIA program does fund rail spurs. So we're increasing there. What we don't always know is when a railroad no longer provides service to a business. So figuring out on the back end where those are dropping off. We know that's happening in some cases, and we don't have a clear inventory of that. And that's something that we can work with our economic development partners throughout the state to keep track of and keep a better inventory of.
Why wouldn't we do that though? I mean,
Pardon me?
why wouldn't DRPT want to know?
That,
mean,
I
that's
think
the
it's a good
fun-
idea. I think it's a good idea. I'd like to put that in. That sounds like something we could do in the rail plan.
Yeah, it should be in the rail plan. And we have 295 or 1,295 active sidings in 2025 in Virginia. They supported X number of inbound loads and X number of outbound loads. That's the statistic level that we need to track to see if we're really making progress. We talk about taking trucks off the road, but we do it in kind of a silo. For this particular project, we're taking trucks off the road. We may be losing ground in other places. And what this needs actually is visibility on the whole system. And are we making progress with our efforts or are we losing ground?
That's bringing up a very good point, because there are many customers that my company has that would use rail if it was more convenient in terms of a rail siding, because otherwise you have rail miles that aren't being utilized because the accessibility for moving cargo from a facility to a rail siding is just not there, not conveniently. I mean, if you have to drive in the wrong direction 100 miles or 150 miles to get to a rail siding, it's not going to be readily used, because he could spend that 100 miles headed to the port or away from the port. So I think Scott brings up a very valid point. So anything you can do to look at, and maybe VEDP or others can be involved to help identify areas that could be, or survey to see who could use rail sidings and where they needs to be evaluated on a regular basis.
So if I may, just thank you. I think this is the exact reason we want to have this subcommittee. And while we are a little bit less today on rail, and as you're going to see, if we move forward a little bit more on transit and the merit scoring process because of this prescriptive timeline that's required, we do plan after proposal and adoption of the SIP to come back to the board to give you an overview of our statewide rail plan and talk about the timeline for updating, which we will be kicking off later this year. So
Great.
all of this will be taken in, and we now know we have a head start as to what we're going to be looking for there.
Well, and, but, you know, you're new in the position. We've had this
Yeah.
discussion over many rounds of the development rail
Okay.
plan. There's some necessary statistics to determine, are we really making progress in this regard? So I'd be
Understood. Thank you.
encouraging you to make sure that's a component of the plan.
I would say maybe in the interest of time, jump to the next slide unless we want to dig in deeper. Okay. And I was basically just going to leave you with, again, similar to transit, we kind of do use this yearly cycle to, as we present the projects to you for the SIP this spring, and then as they get adopted in the summer, we then review, you know, how did things go and make updates in the fall in preparation for the next year's application cycle. So as Director Robinson said, we'll be doing that again and adding in some additional layers such as kicking off the new rail plan and things like that.
That's right. And remember, today we wanted to preview our scoring and methodology on our freight program and our rail preservation program, because they are feeders into the SIP, the development of the SIP. And those projects will be proposed to you next month. But remember, the rail industrial access program is a rolling program. We come to you with every single application throughout the year.
My recollection is that always identifies the number of carloads annually anticipated to do the project.
That's right.
But where do we accumulate that? And I mean, that's one of the challenges we face with trying to assess this. So as a starting point, the first page of this, in my view, should be an executive summary that lists number of miles of rail in Virginia, and then starts to break it down by class, and then break it down by ownership. That should compare to what the last cycle was. Did we lose rail? We're not adding rail in most cases, but did we lose significant portion of our capacity? Sidings, you know, active rail sidings, transload points, spurs, call them what you will, is a really important consideration, because as we've said, without those, we don't really have an effective way of taking trucks off the road. So these are kind of high level macro statistics that I think would benefit the board in making an assessment how we're succeeding or not in the allocations we're making for all the various programs.
Thank you. We'll plan to bring all of that back to you.
Good.
Awesome. I'll invite Grant to come up and start the transit.
Thank you. Mark, the statewide director of our transit program.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. As Secretary Miller and Director Robinson mentioned earlier, my goal today here is to set the stage for the coming months as we do a more comprehensive review of our transit capital and operating programs. We want to give you all just an overview of our current process and what's in the CTB policy for before I dive in, just wanted everybody to understand what MERIT is. MERIT is actually an acronym. It stands for Making Efficient and Responsible Investments in Transit. A number of years ago, the General Assembly had some transit reforms passed, and the MERIT programs were created to respond to those. So it's essentially the branding of our big transit funding programs. So first, I'm going to get into Merit Capital, which state code currently has Merit Capital program that's getting 17% of the Commonwealth Mass Transit funds. So quickly, just a little program history here. DRPT has had a transit capital program for a very long time. And a prioritization process, but over the years, priorities and methods of evaluating project applications have changed. Back in 2018, this was the last time that we really did an overhaul of the capital program. And back in 2018, DRPT staff worked very closely with the Transit Service Delivery Advisory Committee another acronym. We refer to that group as TISDAC. And Dr. Smoot currently sits on the TISDAC committee. And we worked with TISDAC and consultants to develop a prioritization methodology. That methodology is currently in CTB policy. And it was really designed to favor projects that achieve the statewide policy objective of maintaining a state of good repair, or SGR, of existing assets. That policy does state that at least 80% of our merit capital funds have to go to SGR projects. So we always want to fund the assets that we currently have before we're looking at expanding new assets. The second thing that we wanted to do in that policy was to prioritize projects that have the greatest impact on the delivery of public transit services. So that kind of goes without saying. So this policy back in 2018 also introduced 3 new subcategories to our capital program with new maximum state match rates. Those are listed here on the screen. State of good repair is the first with a maximum state match rate of 68%. Our minor enhancement program, again, these are for more expansion projects, will get 68% max state match rate. And then major expansions, which are typically facility projects, and these are defined as any projects that have a total project cost over $3 million. Those have a slightly reduced state maximum match rate of 50%. So all transit agencies in the Commonwealth have been eligible for transit capital funds. But back in FY17, WMATA was taken out of the merit capital program. And then more recently, last fiscal year, FY25, VRE was taken from the capital program. Both WMATA and VRE have set aside amounts out of the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund. So they're not eligible for this program because they get carve-outs of the CMTF. And this program, as well as operating, we do regular reviews to kind of iterate, make improvements. We brought to the CTB back in 2022 some minor changes to this program. I'll touch on those here in a second. But no major changes were made since 2018. So this is just our process, a high-level overview of that process for collecting and evaluating applications in our capital program. Similar to rail, we solicit applications starting on December 1st every year, and we close that application acceptance on February 1st. Once we have all the applications, then do a pretty thorough eligibility and readiness check. I'll go through some of those criteria on the next slide of what we do in that step. But once we get through eligibility and readiness, we then lump each of the capital projects into one of 3 categories. Those 3 categories that I mentioned earlier being state of good repair, minor enhancement, and major expansion. Then in step 4, and consistent with CTB policy, all of the projects are scored according to the methodology outlined in our technical documentation that's posted on the website. And then we rank projects accordingly based on the score. And then once everything is ranked, we bring a set of recommended projects to the CTB in April as part of our draft SIP, and then for action in June.
And in round numbers, how much money are we talking about here?
Generally speaking, in the COVID years, there are certainly some special funds that trickled into our capital and operating programs. I think, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong here, but somewhere on the capital side, it's roughly between $80 and $90 million a year. And I'll give you the similar stat once we get to operating. So this is kind of a list of what we do as part of our screening process. Again, these are the eligibility and readiness reviews after we receive applications. One note here, it does take us about, with the volume of applications that we get, I mean, it's hundreds of applications for our capital program. And the volume makes us, we really need a week or 2 at the very beginning after February 1st to really curate all the data, put it in a format that's easy to consume, and then assign out reviews for each individual application. Again, that takes 1 to 2 weeks. And then we spend roughly 4 weeks doing eligibility and readiness reviews of every single application that comes in. So these kind of items here on this slide walk you through some of the things that we're looking for with each application that comes in. And we do screen out projects that do not meet these requirements. So we obviously look at whether or not the project is even an eligible capital expense. That's kind of an obvious one. We look at the total project costs as well as individual replacement costs, making sure that those costs are reasonable and in line with industry standards. We look at cost estimates and match estimates. We look at if an agency is bringing federal funding to the table as a match, we want to get a better idea of what that federal funding is and the timing of those funds. We look at studies, engineering and design documents, especially if it's a construction project. Any planning work that's gone into those applications, we want to get a better understanding of. Item 6 here is a really important one that we've really put more of a focus on. We want to understand if the transit agency already has executed or open grants in our system for a similar type of project. And if they do, we want to make sure that they're making progress on that older funding before we give them a new grant for the same type of thing. So we've really, I think, refined our process internally for item 6. All grantees are required to submit milestones as part of their application. So we want to make sure that those milestones are realistic, specifically for replacement vehicles, buses mostly. We want to make sure that the vehicle identification numbers or VINs are included because we do a very detailed scoring of those types of applications. And then for any construction project, that's when we tap into our engineering expertise on our team to make sure that the applicant has 30% design plans, has gone through the NEPA process, they have property acquisition plans, engineering cost estimates. It's a lot more detailed for construction projects. So getting back to these 3 kind of buckets of project types, again, state of good repair is kind of the first one, and at least 80% of our funds have to go into that first bucket. These are the replacement of existing assets. Want to be very clear about that, or the rehabilitation of existing assets. Common examples of SGR projects, I want to say like 90 to 95% of our SGR projects every year are replacement revenue vehicles. So we're replacing buses mostly through the SGR program, but we also do replace support vehicles and other major pieces of equipment. On the minor enhancement bucket, these are projects that add capacity or the purchase of new assets that traditionally cost less than $3 million total. So good examples of minor enhancement projects are if a transit agency needs an onboard camera system on their buses, that they've never had cameras on their buses and they want to install cameras. That would be a minor enhancement project if it costs less than $3 million. Another good example would be new facility security gates. If a maintenance facility for transit, if the transit agency has had vandalism issues and they don't have gates on their property, they would apply for new facility gates in the minor enhancement program. Then moving over to the third one on the right, major expansion projects. Again, these are projects that add, expand, or improve transit services. Traditionally, these are facility projects because the threshold is that the total project cost has to exceed $3 million. So it's a capacity expansion project that has a total project cost of over $3 million. Again, these are almost always facilities, but new bus rapid transit infrastructure would technically fall into the major expansion category. But more often than not, it's a new maintenance or operation.
Grant, you shared that we get hundreds of applications. So you might want to add the number of applications that we get for major expansions is much smaller.
Yes, very good point. So traditionally, I want to say we get between 2 to 5 major expansion applications per year. And I'll go over the scoring of those, but definitely not the volume that we get for SGR and minor. SGR, we're getting, I don't know, Dan, maybe 200 to 300 SGR applications per year. More than that?
Yeah, 350 or so.
350. Minor enhancements still in the hundreds, I would say. and then very few major expansions. So this next slide here, this is where we're going to get into the scoring of SGR projects in particular. So there are 3 different areas in which a project can receive points. And the total maximum number of points in SGR is currently set at 110. And again, this is all spelled out in CTB policy, but just to kind of give you guys an overview of each of these different areas for scoring, the asset condition score, each project can get up to 60 points. And we use specific age and mileage if it's a revenue vehicle or support vehicle. We have the mileage for all of those vehicles. It's a state requirement, but we basically use the age and mileage to give it an asset condition score of up to 60 points. The idea with this is that the older the asset is and the more used it is, the higher score it gets in this category. And then, yes, sir.
So I don't see a category that speaks with, says operating efficiency. Tell me what that is. And is there any air quality component to that, fuel use component to it? How does that play out?
Yeah, so after the asset condition score, that service impact score, it's up to 40 points. Want to be very clear that we have essentially a scoring matrix for the service impact score. It's a table, it's in CTB policy. And we had our consultants back in 2018 help us develop that matrix, and its default scores based on those 4 categories: operating efficiency, frequency, travel time, reliability, access to customer experience, and safety and security. Basically, each project type has to fall into one of the buckets of all of the bucket types, and then it's scored based on the impact to those 4 different criteria. So as an example, to get the maximum 40 points, revenue vehicles, so a bus, replacement bus. The consultants in this matrix said that it has a replacement bus has a high impact on operating efficiency, so it gets the maximum 10 points.
But help me understand operating efficiencies. What does that mean? Amount of fuel that it uses, the regularity with which it meets its schedule, the number of breakdowns. But where is that quantified and broken down?
So again, it's a default score. So like technology and admin equipment will get a very low operating efficiency score because the impact of HR software or something like that doesn't really have a huge impact on the transit agency's ability to operate more efficiently. And so this is a matrix. It's not like we're evaluating each application that comes in individually and scoring them individually for operating efficiency. It by default gets a set score based on the project type. So revenue vehicles, again, is an example that I use because the consultants helped us develop this matrix, and it gets 10 points across all 4 of the service impact scoring criteria. So it gets 40 points for operating efficiency because you have to, in order to operate an efficient transit service, you have to have a bus that is not breaking down, on a daily basis. It gets full 10 points for frequency, travel time, and reliability because transit agencies can't provide frequency unless they have the buses to do that. Same with the customer experience. New buses generally have better customer experience. And then newer buses also can achieve safety and security targets because, again, they're not breaking down as frequently. So this is certainly an area that we want to dive deeper into. And I'm happy to follow up for more details on this so you can see that that matrix that's in CTB policy. Because it makes up a significant chunk of the scoring, and we want to make sure that we get those default scores right.
Matrix was one of the many slides we would have added if we had 3 hours this morning instead of 1.
Understand.
But we're just trying to give you the overview, and we're happy to come back and do more.
That'd be helpful because I look down below and I see incentive score for zero emission technology, and that's a total of 10 points for that. Rather significant, and wonder how that relates to the operating efficiency. In many respects, they could be viewed a similar perspective.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
This will be an offline discussion.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Question. once your applicants get sense of these criteria, what keeps them from gaming the system, learning how to stipulate most of the scoring to take advantage of this? Is there any checks for that?
There are, age and mileage are requirements by the state. So for all vehicles, they have to report the odometer readings, age and mileage, twice a year. And we go out once a quarter and meet with all of our transit agencies. And that's one of the things that we're supposed to double check to make sure that they reported the age and mileage of each of their vehicles and that they are accurate. It's actually a disincentive to not report age and mileage because we'll just use whatever the last odometer reading data is. And so there is an incentive to keep up with that asset condition, those two criteria. The service impact score, there's not really a way to game the system there because, again, it's default scores. So I guess an agency could look at those default scores and say, we're only going to apply for revenue vehicles and replacement HVAC systems and like things that score really well. But we also want agencies to do that. We want them to apply for the things that score well in that category. On the incentive scoring, and this is kind of the last piece of SGR scoring, we modified this back in 2022. So this was one of the things that we brought to the CTB to change is the incentive scoring. And the idea here is to reward agencies and projects that satisfy both DRPT and CTB goals and objectives. So zero emission technology is one. So zero emission bus or charging infrastructure would certainly qualify under this. If it's an innovation project, then they would get additional points here. Safety, comfort around customer facilities. This agency accountability one, this is where we brought to the board back in 2022 some changes. We wanted to incentivize good behavior from our transit agencies on reporting data to us. So we have requirements for every transit agency to give us ridership hours and miles on a monthly basis. We ask for 5-year capital budgets. Every agency has to have a compliant transit development plan or transit strategic plan. There are like 5 or 6 things that we require our agencies to provide us every year. And so we're essentially giving bonus points to those agencies that give us all that data on time on a yearly basis. So I guess, Mr. Coleman, getting back to your question, I mean, technically you could kind of game it, but in order to game it, it's kind of fitting into the types of projects that we want to fund either way. Yeah. So
Grant, we have 15 minutes.
okay.
So we got to get to operating. So.
Yes. So I will kind of pick up the pace here. So minor enhancement scoring, I'm not going to spend really much time here at all. This is the exact same scoring criteria used as SGR, with the exception that it does not have an asset condition score because it's not replacing an existing asset. So we don't have age and mileage for what's being replaced because nothing is being replaced. So maximum score on that was 50 points. And then major expansion scoring, as Director Robinson mentioned earlier, we do not get many project applications under this. These are the big projects, over $3 million. But what we do for scoring under this category is that we try to use a smart scale-like scoring apparatus, scoring criteria. So we use those same criteria used in smart scale, but the specific measures on the far right of this table that are utilized are transit specific. So we've kind of tailored the smart scale approach to be transit specific, and want to also kind of highlight here, it's underlined, but it analyzes each project's projected performance benefits relative to the state cost. So every project under major expansion or application rather gets a score that is a cost to benefit ratio, just like sport. Okay, so real quick, just some challenges that we face in the capital program. Wanted to mention a few as we look at our review period for this program. We do not have very long to do those readiness and eligibility checks. Currently, based on our timeline of everything in the development of the SIP, we have roughly 4 weeks to evaluate 400 plus applications in transit capital. So during those 4 weeks, it's a lot of back and forth with transit agencies to collect more information, get questions answered. but we feel as staff that we could certainly do a better job of this if we had more time. Project eligibility is also very broad. We don't really, outside of just it being a capital project and a capital program, we don't specifically in CTB policy indicate that certain types of projects are ineligible. So what that means is that, like, because of our scoring apparatus, every year we have agencies apply for certain types of projects, and we never have enough funding to fund those projects. So we've been talking internally, why do we even make it as eligible? And we go through the process of scoring it if we'll almost never fund it. So that's one thing that we want to think about as we're moving through this review process, is whether or not we want to call out ineligible projects as part of this program. And then last but not least, construction projects. We've definitely enhanced our reviews over the years and added more internal expertise, specifically to help us evaluate construction projects. But these are sometimes huge, over $100 million projects. And to really only have a month or so to evaluate whether or not we should be providing a significant amount of state funding on those projects, it's really just not enough time for us. We would definitely be able to do a much better job with a lengthened time period to review construction projects. We think about smart scale and there's a year plus to review those types of projects. We're given a month. So, and maybe we can find somewhere in between to set a more of a timeline. Okay, so we got about 12 minutes. Switching gears over to operating assistance. Merit operating assistance gets 24.5% of the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund currently. That equates to roughly $120 million per year. And the big difference between operating and capital is that operating is done by formula. These are not individual projects that are being applied for. Every transit agency in the Commonwealth gets a share of the operating revenues that we receive every year. So everyone gets a percentage. So similar to the capital program, the last time we really did an overhaul of the operating program was back in 2018. But we have been using a formula, and we have had performance indicators for many years, almost a decade now. But those performance indicators have changed over the years. And again, back in 2018 was the last time we really did an overhaul to this formula. So again, back then we did, like the capital program, we worked with TISDAC, consultants, all of our transit agencies, stakeholders to develop a methodology for operating assistance and implementing a performance-based operating. So the methodology attempted to balance the need of reliable annual funding, as well as the availability and reliability of performance data to support 6 policy goals identified by that Transit Service Delivery Advisory Committee. Those 6 goals being promote fiscal responsibility, support robust transit service, improve transit patronage, incentivize efficient operations, promote mobility, and support social safety net. So the application intake window is the same as capital. We solicit applications December 1st to February 1st. Every transit agency technically has to apply. And really, it's not your traditional application. We're really collecting financial data from them. So how much money they've spent in operating in years past, as well as what their future budgets are for operating. It's not really like, different criteria that we're asking them to fill out. It's really getting data and financial information from them. After February 1st, our staff at DRPT, we review audited financials and general ledgers from our transit agencies, as I mentioned, as well as agency budgets, and make necessary adjustments. We also validate the performance metrics submitted by our transit agencies over the last year. And then consistent with CTB policy, we implement the formula. And then in April every year, we bring a draft allocations from our operating program as part of the SIP to the board. So if you can advance to the next slide, please. So it's really a 3-step process for our formula. Step 1 is to come up with a sizing metric. In the interest of time, I'll try to just kind of breeze through this one. It is an important first step, but the idea is to introduce a metric that accounts for the relative size of the transit agency compared to the statewide total. So each agency, after the sizing metric, gets assigned a percentage of the statewide total in terms of the transit size. So sizing is made up of operating cost at 50%, ridership at 30%, hours and miles. VRH is vehicle revenue hours, VRM is vehicle revenue miles. So all four of those data points are factored into the transit sizing metric. So we get that percentage after step one. We can move to step two. Then we make these performance adjustments. And we have a graphic here in a few slides, which I think explains this a little bit better. But the performance adjustments that go into the formula after we have step one done include passengers per vehicle revenue hour, passengers per mile, operating cost per hour, operating cost per mile, and operating cost per passenger. And I do want to emphasize here, it's underlined here, that it's each agency's specific data, and it's the trends of each agency relative to the statewide trend. So again, we're talking percentage increases, percentage decreases, not raw numbers. So if you can advance to the next slide, please. And again, I have a graphic that explains all three of these steps here. But the final step, once we make those performance adjustments, we implement a funding cap. So after we get through steps 1 and 2, CTB policy has a 30% cap set on operating assistance allocations. So if a transit, we use agencies' audited financials from the previous year as the basis for that cap. So after steps 1 and 2, if we are projected to give hypothetical transit agency A 40% in state operating funds compared to their previously audited financials, we'll cut them off at 30% and redistribute that 10% to all the agencies that did not hit their 30% cap. So it's kind of like a spillover waterfall effect, which I have a graphic. You can move to the next slide, Andy. Okay, so this is just kind of a summary of that 3-step process. And this is actually using some real data here from last year. But after step 1, agency A got 20% of the operating assistance allocation, which 20% of the allocation came to $26.1 million. If we just use sizing, that $26.1 million would be how much that agency got in the SIP. But we do this step 2 to adjust for performance. And so that agency's passengers per hour, passengers per mile, and so on are compared to the statewide average trend. So you can see that this hypothetical agency did 8% worse, 10% worse, 8% worse, 6% worse, and 19% worse compared to the statewide average for those different factors. Those factors are then combined and normalized to get a normalized trend factor. And for this agency, it was 7% reduction. So we applied, if you multiply 26.1 times -7%, you get that $24.2 million on the right, which is their adjusted allocation after those performance adjustments. And then step 3, this agency is more of a poor performer. And so they did not hit their 30% cap, which means that they are actually a beneficiary of the agencies that do hit their 30% cap. So once we do that redistribution, this agency got $770,000 on the top of that 24.2 to come up with a $24.9 million final operating allocation for this agency. You can flip to the next slide, Andy. Last slides here. So this is just an illustration of that spillover waterfall effect of the 30% cap. Hypothetical agency A, the original after steps 1 and 2, they exceeded their 30% cap. So we took the $7 million, which was the amount that was over the 30% cap, and we redistributed it to agencies B, C, and D who did not hit their 30% cap. Okay, next slide. All right, so like the capital program, wanted to just highlight some challenges with the operating program. This formula, I mean, we gave you the really high level overview. It is very complex once you get into the data, and that presents some challenges for both grantees and decision makers because it's really hard to understand. It's also very difficult for staff and transit agencies to run predictive models. Every transit agency in the state wants to know how much they're going to get. We can't run any models to tell them how much they should expect because there's so many different variables that go in here. So that's definitely something that we want to take a closer look at if we can improve in those areas. And then also we have giant agencies, transit agencies, and we have really small agencies that might only operate one bus during the summer. And somehow we have to make these agencies kind of compete for the same funding on a level scale. So that's another thing as we kind of think of our review is how do we best balance possibly competing goals for those different agencies. So to kind of wrap some things up, talking with our leadership, some areas for improvement and for consideration as we look forward, looking at making our programs stronger and more meaningful with an emphasis on performance-based metrics. We want to just standardize the verification and of effective agency asset utilization, make sure that the agencies actually need the funding before we put it in the SIP. We want to make sure that there's an increased focus on right sizing. We don't want to give agencies buses if they, don't have a need for those vehicle quantities. We want to provide incentives to promote efficiency, as we talked about earlier, and optimization, as well as good grant management practices, and develop metrics to evaluate the return on investment. So we always at DRPT strive to remain best in class in our review scoring and awards of our grant funds and deliver the most value and the best outcomes for our customers as efficiently as possible. So wrapping things up, this is the timeline as we look forward over the course of 2025. We have a lot that we need to do if policy changes are going to be recommended to the board this calendar year. So we're obviously in March, we're wrapping up the SIP right now. We're also presenting to you all this process. We do intend on meeting with the Transit Service Delivery Advisory Committee this month here in March, and we will be walking them through this process really over the next 5 to 6 months. We also want to engage you all, so we're going to come back to you in May, hopefully, to kind of give you a briefing on our review process thus far. And during this time, we're going to be working with consultants and TSDAC to come up with some policy recommendations. Sometime over the summer, it's kind of a key decision point, and we're going to have to figure out, just from a timing perspective, do we want to bring, based on public comment requirements of these policy changes, do we want to bring policy recommendations to the board really in the late summer? Or to allow for a public comment, or are we going to be bringing them in at the end of the calendar year? I think that really just depends on leadership directives and how much we can accomplish over the next few months. So I don't know, Director Robinson, if there's something else you wanted to touch on there.
Thank you, Grant. That was a lot. It's really complex, and the options of timing and when we bring recommendations back to the board really depend on, as Grant mentioned, there is a requirement that any policy changes for the merit program that need to be approved by the CTB 6 months prior to the beginning of a new fiscal year. So in order to be effective for FY27, we would have to have approvals by December. We would have to be coming to you in October and then approvals early because our grant process starts in December. We also could potentially make recommendations and go through the process and hopefully complete by the end of the year without having to rush through, giving our grantees kind of a hold harmless and a year to prepare with their budgets and make the changes effective FY28 after we've done all the work. So with that, we look forward to getting all of your questions and comments and feedback. We may have to do that when we come back, and we can certainly email and follow up along the way. But before we end today, we need to handle something that I forgot to do in the beginning really quickly, because this is the first time a subcommittee meeting has met since March 14th of 2024. We need to approve the minutes from the last meeting that were all included in your board packet. So if I could get a motion to approve the minutes from March 14th, 2024.
Oh, no, who's here?
Anybody here at that last subcommittee meeting?
Yeah, I'll move.
Thank you, Dr. Seuss. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor of approving the minutes from the last subcommittee meeting? Thank you. The minutes are approved and we're going to adjourn so we can all get to the next meeting on time. And we look forward to following up with you all on the questions I'm sure you have.
I'm sure.
That's so much information.